Hello and welcome to week 11 of Race and Ethnicity. This week we're going to be talking about Chinese and Japanese Americans. In the last lecture, we did a general overview of Asian Americans, and in this one, we just want to talk about some of the unique experiences of the Chinese and Japanese immigrants that came to America and those that are residing here along with its citizens. So before the 1880s, you already had this migration. You already had over 100,000 Chinese already living here, okay? However, around this time, you started to have these mixed opinions, okay? There was what you guys read about with the Yellow Peril. You had some prejudice and discrimination toward Asian Americans, and it was just kind of mixed. Like at the same time, Americans were very accepting and kind, but then at the same time, you kind of had this back and forth, okay? The good thing about it was, again, immigration increases the economy. So we initially kind of encouraged the immigration of people from Asia so we could have a lower class workforce. And again, when it came to white Americans in power, of course, they needed a lower class workforce to exploit. So you have these, the stories of the Chinese coming over and building the railroads, for example. However, many people in the US over time started to develop this intolerance toward Asian Americas. Okay, people in the West began to see people from Asia and China and Japan as competition. Okay, so then in 1882, you have this thing that happens, and it's called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this is one of the main themes of this lecture, is just talking about the consequences of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Okay, so the only group in American history that has ever had their citizenship rights revoked are the Chinese, okay? However, after a couple years of this, what starts happening is all Asians, as we talked about last week, get brought into this category, and all of them get caught up in the umbrella category of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which is an entirely prejudicial and discriminatory immigration policy toward people from Asia that originally started with China. It was repealed in 1943, but if you guys look at some of the history of World War II and things like that, and you ask why did the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, for example, one reason for bombing Pearl Harbor was racism. It's not something you're going to read about in your history books because it's something that almost requires a sociological perspective. But Americans consider the Japanese and the Chinese inferior, and the Japanese, they wanted to show the world that we're not an inferior group. So one reason for bombing Pearl Harbor was just to show the world, and it was their means of kind of overcoming racism in America. Because, for example, the Japanese helped the United States in World War One. And then they requested that we allow them to immigrate to the United States, but because of our racist policies, we continued to deny access to people that were from Japan, for example, and then we treated them as inferior, and so that motivates the Japanese to bomb Pearl Harbor. And again, history, when you take a sociological perspective to it, it kind of changes the way you see things certain ways, okay? So since then, we've had 100,000 new Chinese people coming over. And then in current modern times, there's 3.5 million Chinese Americans in the United States currently, okay? But the effects of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the repealing it in 1943 was, even though discrimination and prejudice has gone down for people from China, for example, and against Asians in general, you still have these prejudicial and discriminatory attitudes that are present in modern times, okay? The book talks about the Chinatowns. It gets a little bit into family life. It talks about social organization. So there's a lot of really interesting cultural aspects there. So make sure you guys look over that in your book. Contemporary Chinese Americans were largely barred from participating. Now, though, they can have access much more than they ever have historically. And so what you're starting to see is, a lot of Asian groups are doing very, very well in America. But this is because our level of intolerance, again, has gone down. It's just, throughout American history, our intolerance goes up toward Asians, goes down, goes up, and then it goes back down again. And so you've seen this over time, and hopefully that has leveled out, and Americans in modern times are embracing diversity and multiculturalism and no longer holding and having ideologies that are prejudicial and discriminatory against different groups of people, for example. You are starting to see the Asian community assimilate into white culture. Again, this goes back to the idea of whiteness. And we did talk last week about the idea of the model minority, but still, just because a lot of people are doing very well in the Asian community, for example, that doesn't mean that poverty doesn't exist. Same thing for white people. There's far more whites in poverty than any other race, for example, despite the fact that whites have access and privilege. So it's just things to think about, okay? So Japanese Americans, they ended up receiving the same prejudice as all other Asians, including people from India and Pakistan, etc., as a result of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But during World War II, and this is what your discussion's all about, we interned the Japanese Americans. And so you guys are going to watch a video that goes over that. And it's very interesting. But just so you can kind of understand the direct experience of what that involved, okay? In modern times, people from Japan, Japanese Americans, are doing very well. They do have the lowest rates of poverty amongst other Asian groups. However, you are starting to see this assimilation of that culture into white culture. And again, is white culture American culture, or are Asians assimilating into American culture? And by assimilating into American culture, does that mean you're assimilating into white culture? Because again, culture is dictated by the dominant group that's in power. So again, this is why it's incredibly important to embrace all forms of minority so we don't lose all these wonderful rich cultures. And we've seen that happen with the Native Americans, African Americans. A rich historical culture has been destroyed by conquering and suppression. Okay, so again, pretty quick lecture this week just because we did a pretty thorough one with the Asian Americans. And so for this week, just really be thinking about the effects of the Chinese Exclusion Act, be thinking about the effects of internments upon Japanese, how does that affect their psyche, for example, and then, some interesting facets about the culture, family life, how things are structured. I wish you guys the best. Have a wonderful week. Please email with any questions.